جیوگی باز می شود. این شما و مهمان این هفته جیوگی گپ و گفتگویی درباره بحران. اسلاوی، این هفته ما داریم درباره بحران صحبت می‌کنیم در جیوگی. بینندگان ما کنجکاون بدونن که از منظر یک فیلسوف اروپایی مهمترین و بزرگترین بحران‌های جهانی کدوم هستن؟ اگه بخوای به 3 تا بحران اصلی اشاره بکنی، به 3 تا بحران جهانی، چیا رو نام میبری؟
When we talk about crisis today, we should be very specific what crisis do we mean. When I was over a year ago in Seoul, South Korea, people there started to laugh when I talked about crisis. They told me, wait a minute, America, United States are getting out of the crisis. Generally, even African countries are progressing. The Far East, China, Korea, Vietnam, and so on are doing better and better. So they told me, where is the crisis? Except Western Europe. The crisis or Southern Europe. So their idea is that the crisis is not really global crisis, but just the crisis of Southern Western Europe. And they even claim that although we read so much about terrorism, wars, refugees, and so on, this was happening all the time. But if you look at in a broader perspective, this is typical claim of them, humanity was never doing as good as it is doing now. Now, I don't agree with this line of argumentation. I just want to draw attention to a crucial fact that, crisis is never a neutral one. Crisis is always crisis with regard to some expectations. What we today consider a crisis, it was probably 500, 1,000 years ago, or even less, a normal state of things. So again, we should be very specific. But in spite of this, I think, agreeing with your question, that there are 3, even, I would have said, as I developed in my books, 4 domains where we do confront a crisis. The first one is the problem of environment. I think it is clear that if our development goes on the way it does now, we are approaching a certain deadlock. I'm not only talking about global warming, I'm talking about air quality. I heard that you in Tehran, you also have this problem, but it's much worse. Just go to Beijing or Shanghai and take a stroll. They no longer have only that cloth on their face, white cloth, the simple mask. They have real gas masks now. I mean, Beijing today, it's like a landscape from some dystopian Hollywood film where already every day is becoming terrifying. So it's ecology. We don't know what's happening. We don't even have an idea how to counteract it and so on. I claim that the liberal model of global market economy is obviously reaching certain limits. You cannot do it. You cannot go on indefinitely the way we were going on. There will be new and new crises. More and more people are displaced and so on. This brings us to the third crisis, critical point. The crisis, I would say, the crisis of new walls of refugees. I mean, what is happening today globally? Something very sad, I claim, that more and more humanity is falling apart into those who live under cupola, I call it, safe place under an invisible big cover where certain standards are maintained, and those who are out. And the problem of refugees is that those who are out want to come in. And this problem, if anything, is becoming more and more difficult. A new division, worldwide division, is coming, which I think is even worse than the old class divisions about which Marxism was speaking. And then the last problem, which we should not underestimate, is the problem of biogenetics. Are we aware how quickly things are happening there? I'm trying to follow what goes on there. I claim that if things will be left just to spontaneous development, then soon we will live in a place which will be like some science fiction dystopias. A minority will genetically modify their own children themselves and will control the stupid majority kept out. Like literally, those in power, those who rule us, will become, I claim, not only a different class, but a different biological. This is happening in front of our eyes. I think that maybe this is even the deepest crisis. I'm not exaggerating here, because you know what is happening? Make a simple reflection. What is our basic sense of freedom? It is that reality is out there, but what I think, nobody can touch me here. And even, if I may, I hope it will be respectful enough, make a reference to Quran. Even there is a nice passage, you know, I read Quran. It says in Quran, if you are an atheist, that's your free decision. Nobody can force you to believe, only you should behave publicly in a proper way. So you see, it admits this basic human freedom. Do I really believe or not, that's my inner matter. But this presupposes the difference between inside and outside. But this difference today is slowly undermined, not only with psychodrugs, new pharmacomeans, and so on, but also with direct connection between our brain and outside. Do you know that at the very elementary level, our brains can be already linked to computers, so that on the one hand, we humans become almost divine. Like, you know, Stephen Hawking, he no longer needs his finger to move his wheelchair. His brains are already connected to the computer, so he thinks forward and his wheelchair moves forward. But you know, it goes also in the other directions. Computers can also already detect, up to a point, it's still very primitive, what goes on in our brain. That is to say, scientific manipulation through chemical drugs, through biogenetic interventions of our brain, confronts us with this big, difficult problem. What is our freedom? And incidentally, even at the level of religion, which for some people is our innermost, most authentic experience, there are problems. Do you know that there is already a new scientific discipline called something like digital brain theology, where they try to locate what happens in your brain when you have a deep mystical or whatever religious experience. And do you know what's the goal? The goal is, I had to laugh, to develop what they call wrongly a transcendental pill. You don't have enough faith, you take a pill, you will start to believe, and so on. I mean, these are mega problems. Things are happening today. So to stop these 4 levels of crisis I see today, I don't know. Oh my God. You mean internet?
خب به نظر مثل متاسفانه اینترنت شما یه مقدار کیفیتش کم شده، ما نمیتونیم خوب شما رو بشنویم. اگر امکان داره اتاقتون رو عوض بکنید یک بار دیگه. و تو این فاصله من میرم سر سوال بعدیم. خب شما به این 4 بحران اشاره کردید. من کنجکاوم بدونم که از منظر شما ریشه های این بحران ها چی هستند. بالاخره این بحران ها معلول یک وضعیتن. درباره ریشه ها صحبت بکنید و درباره راه حل ها. آیا این بحران ها راه حلی هم دارند؟
I think this crisis is ultimately, apart from critical points, of course, like Syria and Iraq war and so on, it's basically a crisis of Western Europe. That's the true critical point. Western Europe is losing steam. And I don't think that all people who are opposed to Europe, criticizing Eurocentrism and so on, should be too glad about it. I think that it's an effect of something, this European crisis, of something pretty sad, of how what was capitalism at its best? This, after World War II, social democratic welfare state capitalism, where everybody was guaranteed a certain standard of living, social safety, freedom, and so on, that this model is in deep crisis. Ironically, you know how I refer to this model? I don't know how well known he was in Iran. You remember in the 1990s, it was Francis Fukuyama, the end of history. And it's incredible how, although people mock Fukuyama, but most of us still believe in him. We silently accept that liberal democratic capitalism is the best order that we have. And that the majority of leftists today want to be is, I call them ironically, leftist Fukuyamaists, you know. They accept the frame of liberal democratic state and democracy, but more welfare, more personal freedoms, more democracy, whatever. I wonder if this is enough. I don't think that our ecological predicament will be resolved, or that even we can deal with the danger properly within liberal democratic capitalism. We need large-scale collective acts which will have to be coordinated, regulated, not only at the state level. My God, our very survival is at stake. Imagine just, I spoke with some of my Japanese friends who told me, you remember a couple of years ago the Fukushima tsunami explosion of the nuclear plant there. They told me, if that explosion would have been a tsunami, just a little bit stronger, they already thought for one day they would have to do it what? The whole Tokyo area, 40-50 million people, would have to be evacuated. Where? How? And when you have global warming, when you have radical changes in our weather, and so on, air pollution, and so on, market is not strong enough to deal with these problems. That's first crisis, ecological crisis. Second crisis, I think, it's the crisis immanent to capitalism itself. Many observers demonstrated that with latest development in, let's call them digital economy, digital sciences, and so on, the way our lives are regulated through robots, through digital machinery, and so on, something is emerging which no longer can function within market and private property. That's why capitalism has such big problems with so-called intellectual property. And we are, in a way, already there, half in communism. The problem is that this commons, the new shared space, is again privatized. For example, we have cyberspace as a common collective space, and how did Bill Gates become the wealthiest person in the world? He privatized this common space, and we are paying him rent. It's not profit, it's rent. If you look closely at Bill Gates, where does this money come from? The price of Windows program has no relationship to the production costs. He simply estimates how much he can charge, and so on. So this phenomena and problem with banks and so on, speculative capital, it's clear that immanently market economy is approaching its end. Globalization paradoxically means new walls, more divisions, more walls for free circulation of people, which is why I claim we will have more and more of problems with refugees, with those who simply have no permanent home, wants to transgress borders, how to deal with all these problems. These four problems, I don't think even the best liberal democratic capitalism can deal with them. And for me, again, this is the problem today. It's the problem of what I call of communism. I don't mean, of course, Soviet Union and those Stalinist communism. What I mean is that these are problems of commons, of some space which should be shared by all of us. Ecology is the problem of our natural environs as our commons, our common space. Intellectual property is the same, our commons, our intellectual inheritance. Biogenetics is our genetic collective inheritance, and so on and so on. This is the problem. And I think the cause of this problem is the same. I'm not blaming capitalism. Let's make it clear. I think that, and Marx knew it, he was all the time emphasizing it, capitalism is the most efficient, dynamic, productive system in the history of humanity. But I claim today it is gradually reaching its limits. And the tragedy is that we don't have a precise idea how to get out of it, how to confront its destructive implications. And so again, I think that I don't blame capitalism. It's not the point that it's guilty, but all the problems we have today are basically the problems of global capitalism. Even what we in the West today scare, what we are afraid most, so-called Islamic terrorism and so on, ISIS, Daesh or whatever. But look at them. In the way ISIS, Islamic State, functions, it's crucial to see how it appears to be in its ideology a radical, even traditionalist, I don't know, Muslim organization. But if you look at its actual organization, it's like a modern mafia. It's totally, not even modern, postmodern dynamic organization, probably dealing with oil, smuggling, drugs, selling ancient sculptures, and so on and so on. So what I'm claiming is that even such an organization like Daesh, like Islamic State, which pretends to totally oppose decadent Western culture, is in its mode of functioning already, in its organization and so on. It's already totally infected by the West. So, and I think, sorry, just to finish that, we had welfare state, social democracy, which as long as it functioned, it wasn't so bad. We had Stalinist communism. Maybe it worked a little bit at the beginning when you had to industrialize quickly a country. But afterwards, when industrialization was done, it no longer worked. And apart from this old nostalgia for local communities where people self-organize themselves, but this model cannot be globalized, this is what always shocks me. Whenever we have a great protest movement in Greece, from Podemos to Syriza to Occupy Wall Street, I was going all around and asking them the same question, demonstrators, protesters there. What do you want? What type of change do you want? I never got a clear answer. I think that the ultimate problem behind all these problems is that we need a radical change, but today's left does not have an answer. What kind of change, how to do it, and so on and so on. And this situation where we all know the change is needed, but we are not oriented into how to do it, these are very dangerous moments. Was it popular among young people in Iran also, that film with Natalie Portman and so on, V for Vendetta? You remember what happens in the end. The crowd penetrates the parliament, people take over, and end of the film. I could just see a film called V for Vendetta Part 2. But what happens then? Okay, the people takes over, we are all enthusiastic. What happens then? What will they do? Will they nationalize economy or what? How will they impose a new order? You know, this is what makes me so suspicious of all these new explosions of the left, from Syriza to Podemos, or even to Arab Spring in Egypt and so on, or even in Turkey. It's all so nice as long as we have the big revolution. Millions of people on the streets, we all cry with them and so on. What interests me is, as they say, to designate in English the alcoholic state, the morning after. But what happens when the big events are over and when life returns to normal? How will ordinary people feel the change?
شما در مطالعات اجتماعی و فرهنگی با مفهوم فانتزی مشهور و معروف شدید. ما در زبان فارسی از کلمه فانتزی استفاده می‌کنیم و غالباً منظورمون توهمه. مثلا میگیم اشکال فانتزی، چیزهایی که خیالی هستن. ولی برای شما فانتزی یه چیز پیچیده تره. اگر بخواید به زبان ساده فانتزی رو توضیح بدید به ما چی میگید؟ فانتزی یعنی چی؟
Fantasy is not something that's crucial. Okay, I don't have time now to go into Lacanian theory, but fantasy is not simply you fantasize as opposed to reality. The most elementary definition in psychoanalysis of fantasy would have been that it's not, let's say, I want something, I fail, I don't get it, so I fantasize about doing it. No. Fantasy is that unconscious, usually, structure of my desire, which explains why do I love that woman or that man or whatever. Fantasy provides the coordinates of my desire. Our experience is chaotic. Fantasy is a kind of a, almost, if I may put it in philosophical terms, a transcendental horizon, a texture of meaning, which makes my experience of reality meaningful. When people say, now it's the end of the ideology, now I'm a realist, now I just want to see the way things really are. For example, in the Western world, in the 1990s, when it was over with communism and so on, people said, okay, utopias are over, now we live in the real world. But what was this real world? The world of capital and so on, which is precisely purest of all ideologies. So again, the same as for fantasy holds for me for ideology. Ideology for me is not just some abstract theory dealt with philosophers, sociologists, and so on. Ideology is how we experience our daily life. And here it's difficult to fight racism and prejudices and so on. Because, you know, I don't know how it is in Iran, but a typical citizens of the developed West today, they will say, I don't care about ideology, I'm tolerant, and so on, I respect others. Yes, but when you encounter the real other, all these ideologies explode into your face.
بیایید درباره نسبت بحران و فانتزی صحبت بکنیم. چه شکلی فانتزی بعضی وقتا مردم رو از درک و مواجهه با بحران محروم میکنه؟ به طور خاص شما درباره اروپا خیلی صحبت کردید. چه شکلی در سنت اروپایی، در تجربه اروپایی فانتزی بعضی وقتا باعث شده که بحران‌ها درک نشند؟
Fantasy doesn't prevent us to see the crisis, but it mystifies the crisis. It asks the wrong question. For example, again, back to Germany in 1920s and 30s, there was an economic crisis which was very real. The same in the West today. There is in Western Europe a crisis, inertia, instability, and so on. But fantasy enters when you perceive this crisis as the result of some foreigners, immigrants, or whatever, intruding, disturbing our way of life. Fantasy always, if I may use these traditional Marxist terms, obfuscates, masks the immanent antagonism. I think that what we project onto Middle East, Arab, North African immigrants is our own contradiction, our own problem. We in Europe are basically our own problem. We are in crisis. And this crisis was not triggered by too many immigrants or whatever.
خب اجازه بدید بریم سراغ انتخابات آمریکا و نظرات جنجالی شما که بعضی اعتقاد داشتن که شما رسما از آقای ترامپ حمایت کردید. من میخوام به این موضوع بپردازم، اما قبل از اون من یک سوال دیگه دارم. من دقت کردم در نوشته‌های شما گفته بودید که علت پیروزی آقای ترامپ قسمتش به خاطر این بوده که یک ذهنیت لیبرال در آمریکا سر کار بوده که اون ذهنیت لیبرال توانایی درک مسئله طبقه محروم و مستضعف رو نداره. سوال من، چه نگاهی، چه طرز تفکری در این رویکرد لیبرال وجود داره که همواره از درک مسئله و مشکلات طبقه محروم غافله؟ چه اتفاقی داره میفته در این ذهنیت؟ چه فانتزی اینجا سر کاره؟ این شکلی هم میشه سوال رو طرح کرد. چه فانتزی در این طبقه در حال جریانه که نمیتونه مشکلات و مسائل طبقه پایین رو ببینه؟
The ultimate reason of Hillary Clinton's defeat was that many of those who voted in the primaries for Sanders were so disappointed at how Hillary brutally destroyed Sanders that they either even some of them, some 20% at least, voted for Trump, or they simply abstained. They didn't go to vote. The Democratic Party totally neglected or dismissed as nationalist, proto-fascist, and so on, some real discontent of ordinary people. And it's not just the United States, it's also all of Western Europe. We have this surprising success of UKIP in Britain. We have now Marine Le Pen in Germany, the Alternative for Germany, and so on and so on. So that's my vision. This was the educated, liberal middle class. Its basic problems were cultural problems. Tolerance, the protection of sexual minorities, and so on, all that. And they were simply blind or even deeply distrustful of the problems of ordinary people. It happened, I think, already with this rise of cultural studies in 1980s. I think that this predominance of cultural studies was the theoretical expression of it. And then, in theory, deconstruction, Michel Foucault, and so on, all this obsession with minorities, you know. I think that, and I think, again, the reason for this was not that these left liberals are evil or whatever, but that, again, the left, till 1970s, 80s, the left did have some kind of global vision, either state socialism or welfare state or whatever. For the last 30, 40 years, again, I don't think the left really has a minimal even vision of future. Even if they are anti-capitalist, their anti-capitalism is mostly moral. It's racist, sexist, and so on. But so it's very fashionable to talk about corruption, corrupted bankers, and so on. But the basic question, what can we replace capitalism with? And how to do it? Who will be the revolutionary agent? And so on. Additional answer, my answer would simply have been that even a very vulgar class approach, this is the mindset of the educated middle class, of the intellectual elite. And which, critical as it may appear, it basically simply fully accepts the global capitalist framework. Even if it appears to be a little bit anti-capitalist and so on. I think we don't have even to ask what is in the problem of this mindset is this mindset itself, which is, again, clearly limited to even upper middle class, out of touch, and so on. And as if it, being aware of this limitation, it tries to overcome it through this extreme politically correct moralism, you know, censoring how do you speak, and so on. It's a very tragic situation, I think.
خب با این اوصاف این سوال پیش میاد که اون وقت چرا شما از آقای ترامپ حمایت کردید؟ البته دلایل و انگیزه‌های خودتون رو داشتید، درباره‌اش صحبت کردید، ولی من دوست دارم یک بار دیگه از شما این سوال رو بپرسم. چرا شما با این نگاهتون از یک شخصی مثل آقای ترامپ در انتخابات ریاست جمهوری آمریکا حمایت کردید؟ متاسفانه زمان ما تموم شده، ولی گفتگو من با آقای ژیژک اینجا ادامه داره. انشالله هفته آینده نسخه کامل این گفتگو رو از شبکه 2 سیما پخش خواهیم کرد. تا فردا شب که با جمع جیوگی در خدمتتون هستم. فعلا خدا نگهدار.